All right. Good day. This video I'm putting together here is meant to serve two purposes. It will stand as the final lecture kind of conversation for my current 409 students, the rhetorical tradition class that I'm teaching two sections of. And it's also meant to help kick off a conversation about the future of rhetoric that I've been invited to participate in by Professor Stephanie Willis. She's teaching 211, the Survey of Rhetorical Tradition. So it's sort of a 200 level and a 400 level version of the classes we offer in rhetoric. And this question of where's rhetoric going, I think, is a great one. And I've been thinking about it a lot myself over the last, while, frankly. And appreciate the opportunity to throw some thoughts together. And so I've got a couple pages of notes here just to help keep on track. I'm going to try to do this in about 15 minutes. I'll offer some caveats here. First one is everything I'm going to be saying is deliberately broad and kind of provocative. And so lots of qualifications, lots of nuance needs to be added to much of what I'm about to say. And a lot of it can be found in other videos that are on my YouTube channel for the different classes that I teach. And so I encourage you to explore that if you're interested. The other thing is that the approach that I take to thinking about rhetoric is materialist, meaning that I am most interested in conditions as we find them and how that shapes behavior, practices, thought. Right, so real world stuff, real kind of hard physical stuff is where I like to kind of begin my thought process for what matters and what we're doing and why we're doing it. So the relationship between kind of conditions, material conditions, right, like hot, cold, abundance, scarcity, these kinds of like hard realities are where I look to and then sort of think about rhetorical practices out of that. So I'm going to end up where we're at now, which is on this question of like, where's rhetoric going? But in order to get there, I need to jump back to the beginning to think about this sort of question of, what do we mean when we talk about rhetoric? Like, what are we actually focusing on here? And so for my current students, this should be a little bit of a review summary of stuff we've been talking about. Rhetoric, at least theories of rhetoric, textual commentaries and pedagogical manuals and such on how to do the thing that we call rhetoric started to appear in the 5th century BC in Greece. And why then? Why there, right? So again, conditions. There were some social, structural, political changes that were happening in major ones and significant ones that ended up giving rise to rhetorical practice. The rise of democratic institutions, not perfect democratic institutions, not broad-based democracy, but the first examples of democratic practice were taking shape in Athens at the time. Also, cultural renaissance, a time of great flowering of ideas, of expansion of, theories, philosophies, plays, right? Just a lot of intellectual vigor that goes along with democracy. That's important, I think. And also institutionalized pedagogy, schools, academies, as they were called, right? So all of these things kind of work together. You have new system of courts, new system of public assemblies for political discussion. You have juries of peers. You have broad audiences that speakers were trying to win over and appeal to. And this is where theories of rhetoric first came about. Now, in my other classes, I talk about 4 major traditions and like, what is rhetoric? Well, we can think about it sort of 4 different ways. And those 4 different traditions are headed up by 4 major figures. So we have what I call the sophistic, or more specifically, the Gorgianic tradition of rhetoric. We have the Platonic tradition of rhetoric. We have the Aristotelian tradition of rhetoric, and we have the Isocratean tradition of rhetoric. And I can't go into much detail on those, but I will sort of quickly characterize them. The Gorgianic or sophistic tradition is all about contingencies, about things being able to change on a dime, and so being able to persuade audiences using sort of any means possible. This is an instrumental and quite coercive model. The Platonic model is quite different in the sense that it's really, really committed to absolute certainty, especially like moral certainty. And it doesn't have a lot of interest in persuading audiences in terms of kind of give and take. It's more about understanding what is right and then doing whatever you have to honor that. The third tradition is the Aristotelian tradition. This is a tradition of probabilistic thinking, right? The kind of guesswork of trying to figure out an audience and what you might know about an audience and working with that, using your inventional powers of reason and understanding pathos and understanding ethos and logos. That's Aristotle. The last one is Isocrates, and we can think of that as the kind of the civic debater tradition. This is Aristotle was less interested in actual practice. He was more interested in sort of understanding the best possible case given the situation. Isocrates is more about like, here's how you become a statesman. Here's how you become a citizen leader, an oratorical leader, right? And it was really heavily emphasis on particulars. These particulars of this case and being as artful and persuasive and encompassing as you can. So 4 traditions, I like to think of these as sophistic equals contingencies, Platonic equals absolutes, Aristotle, the Aristotelian tradition equals probabilities, probabilistic reasoning, Isocrates equals particulars. Now, 2 of these traditions are pro-democracy and 2 of them are anti-democracy. The pro-democracy traditions are the Aristotelian and Isocratean traditions, because they're really all about kind of working with audiences, trying to persuade audiences, knowing what you know about them, knowing what you know about situations, and doing your very best to try to loop them in and appeal to them and identify with them. And it's this kind of give and take. It's a reciprocal kind of process, right? The Gorgianic, sophistic, and Platonic traditions are anti-democratic in the sense that neither of them are particularly interested in the kind of the integrity of the deliberative process, right? The Platonic tradition, again, is about understanding what is right, what is absolutely true, and then adhering to that in all costs. He talks about leading souls. Very tricky to do, right? The Gorgianic tradition, the sophistic tradition, is more about outcomes, achieving outcomes by any means possible. So using eloquence, using style, using magical kind of displays of reason and so on to kind of just win over an audience or achieve an outcome just through sheer power of artistry and eloquence, right? So you can see that the tendency with the Gorgianic tradition is to be sort of coercive potentially, or deceptive or deceitful, or slick and slippery, and doing whatever it takes to achieve the outcome you want, right? So those 4 traditions, 2 democratic, 2 anti-democratic. All right, so there we go. So in the total history of rhetoric, there are, I would say, 3 major kind of social, historical, structural shifts that happened when we talk about the kind of the story of rhetoric. The first one I've already mentioned. That's the rise, the emergence of rhetoric as a social practice, as a disciplinary concern, as a matter of theoretical interest, and so on. The next one kicks in the 16th and 17th century. So we just jump straight into the early Renaissance and early modern period. There, the big story is the marginalization of rhetoric for about 300 to 400 years, starting around the early phases of the Renaissance and the early modern period, with the rise of empiricism, the scientific approach. So the emphasis coming out of Francis Bacon being on empirical certainty, trying to understand the objective world as thoroughly as possible. Meanwhile, there's also Descartes and the tradition of internal certainty, logical certainty, right? So Descartes was all about, I think, therefore I know, therefore I am, right? The thinking is all that matters, right? So the privileging of sort of abstract internal thought and all the logical rigor that you bring to that. You think about those 2 together. You think about Bacon and the scientific mapping of reality for objective certainty, and you think about Descartes and the kind of internal logical analysis of possibilities giving rise to logical certainty, right? Those 2 things really dominated Gosh, this is moving quickly here. Really dominated the modern period. The whole world for the last 400 years was changing in major ways, right? The rise of the telescope, the adding machine, the first computational machines. So many changes that were just shaking up the very nature of our understanding of reality. And so rhetoric was not important. It was a kind of an old luxury, an old kind of unreliable way of dealing with people. Science and logic, the power of reason was ascendant for 300-400 years, and it's only in the 20th century that we started to move out of that, right? And we can talk about that modern period through the kind of the dominance of objective facts over subjective values, the dominance of the mind over the body. And this is just sort of how things went for a long time. So think about the Industrial Revolution, all the technological developments, all the scientific developments and discoveries, and that was the kind of the core of social interest and activity for quite a while. Things are changing almost completely in an inverted sense today. So that leads us to the third major shift, which is actually happening right now. And I'm calling this the 21st century return of mythopoetics, right? So if for the last 3-4 centuries, the dominance of objective facts, science, logic, reason, right? These are the things that we need to focus on that will help answer all problems, all social problems. Now things are kind of flipping over into the other direction, where now subjective values and the bodies and sensations and feelings and morality and all that stuff that for the modern period was thought to be distorting and distracting, unreliable, like that stuff is now what is driving most of our public engagements, our social priorities, and so on, cultural values. And here I see, getting back to the conditions business, here I see two important conditions happening. One is the Anthropocene and the other is digital monopolies. If you've taken any class, environmental stuff, or kind of been paying attention, then this term Anthropocene just to sort of signals this geological shift, this epoch, where for the first time in planetary history, the major force that's shaping geological reality on this planet is humanity, right? And so culture, human invention is now like the single biggest driver of ecological consequence, okay? And so that is now starting to affect our lives in major ways. The fires out in California, those fires out in Australia, storms are getting worse, droughts are getting worse, right? And that is giving rise to all kinds of turbulence, social turbulence and upheaval. People are moving, people are being uprooted, homelessness is increasing. This is why we're starting to talk about walls more and more, and fences more and more, and borders more and more, and inclusion and exclusion, all this kind of stuff. There's so much social kind of upheaval that's happening, and a lot of this is being driven by just the earliest flickers of this climate crisis that we're going to be dealing with. So that's a huge part of it. The other conditional thing that I'm noting is digital monopolies, not just digital devices, but the monopolization of this industry by a couple of major corporations whose monetary incentives are really just focused around attention, right? Our attention, keeping us glued to our devices and our screens as much as possible. The algorithms that are driving our engagement are really just sort of preying on our kind of need for connection and affirmation and validation and outrage and vanity and all of these kind of affects, these kind of basic sensations that we all have in us. The quickest way to get someone to, pay attention to their device is to show them something shocking or maddening or outrageous or, whatever. And that's the kind of the logic of these platforms that is now spilling out into the larger social world. So digital monopolies have turned our devices against us in the drive for data. Algorithmic self-affirming feedback loops. We have surveillance. We have badgering. We're badgered constantly to pick up our devices and engage. Addiction, distorted affects, emotions. Detachment, isolation, extremism, paranoia, cynicism. I mean, the insurrection in January is a pretty good example of like where we're at and the fact that like so much of what we consider to be reality is being mediated to us through these algorithms that do in fact kind of distort. They don't necessarily like create things whole cloth out of new, but they prey on our susceptibilities and they kind of take us further and further in the direction of where we want to go. And that ends up in these really extreme places. So we're in an extreme time. I need to try to bring this to a close here. So today's public sphere, I've been teaching a class on the public sphere for a long time. I don't know if I can teach it as a live thing anymore, maybe as a historical thing. The public sphere is functionally dead. The Aristotelian and Isocratean models of probabilistic reasoning, sort of guesswork, making inferences about audiences, using your kind of best understanding of where people are at, where a situation is at, where there's some flexibility, there's some possibility for things going this way or that way. That's probabilistic reasoning. Those traditions are really no longer in play. So that leaves us with the two other traditions, the Gorgianic and the Platonic traditions, that I see being ascendant today and moving forward. So these are a combination then of moral certitude, which is Plato, and outcome engineering. That's the Gorgianic tradition, right? So the Gorgianic tradition is about instrumental uses of language or mediation to guarantee outcomes. That's very algorithmic. That's very much about what we're seeing on these digital platforms, right? So smash these things together. Excuse me, going too fast here. You smash these models together, you get absolute moral certainty coupled with the power to just sort of secure outcomes, right? Without necessarily talking or dialoguing, deliberating, turn-taking. These kinds of things are no longer part of the mix. Our persuasive labors increasingly resemble the dynamics of our social platforms. They're binaristic, they're blunt, they're attention-seeking, they're ally-demanding, and they're rooted in sensations, all about the vibes. You hear this a lot, right? So the digital platforms appeal to our sensations, and sensations has now kind of spilled over into the wider world, and this is what we are now going for, is just sort of like immediate appeal, immediate affect. All right, I got to wrap up here. So my hunch, finally, is that rhetorical practice moving forward will continue to be less about the social and public dynamics of appeal, inference, invitation, openness, turn-taking, and more about the securing of partisan outcomes through mediational design practices. So I see the wielding of policies, laws, and platforms as the new landscape of rhetorical practice moving forward. And so this has very little to do with public give and take. This is sort of skirting the public. And for me, if you skirt the public, you're skirting democracy. So the big question here is like, what is happening with democracy moving forward? Because in fact, appetites for democracy are starting to diminish across the board on all sides of the kind of political spectrum. So where does that leave us? It should be obvious by now that we are moving away from rhetorical practices of democracy toward something else. Perhaps a techno-social future where all outcomes are made possible via the digital circuitry of attentional warfare. What matters is getting people to pay attention, and once paying attention to kind of be a part of the sensation, right? And using the digital, whatever means of digital engagement at our disposal to get those attention-seeking bodies on our side versus that side, right? This is a world where things happen as an extension of our collective wills, but without broad-scale cooperation. So we're in a weird, precarious moment for rhetoric. Sort of, I think, where we were in the 16th, 17th century, where rhetoric was sort of shuffled off to the side. In place, we had objective reason, science, logic, da-da-da. That was the main emphasis for so long. Now things have really flipped over, and now it's like objective facts and science and logic and all that are getting kind of shunted aside, and instead it's more about my perception, my feeling, my sensation, or our sensation. And I think the pandemic and this whole madness around masks and so on that we've gone through in the last year is a really interesting illustration of how these things are playing out. It seems like it was a lot harder than it needed to be. And so that, to me, is like a test case for what we're going to have to confront with the oncoming climate catastrophes, because they're not going to get any easier anytime soon. So we do need cooperation. We do need the best possible arguments, cases, evidence that we can get, and we need to be able to rely on everyone's ability to sort of see that and accept that and follow that. But that seems a far off possibility right now. So this is not me being super chipper about where we're headed, either in terms of rhetoric or in terms of our democracy or in terms of our culture. We are in tough times, and hopefully classes in rhetoric can help remind us that, like, citizenship, publicness, listening, paying attention, appealing to others, not being sort of immediately suspicious of others, trying to give people the benefit of the doubt and hoping that they do the same for us, not trying to make things about sort of personhood and identity so much, but trying to, as much as possible, get to what it is that we connect with and share together. Because when it comes to the climate and when it comes to some of our biggest problems, these are not sort of red-blue problems or East Coast rural problems, city, rural, East Coast country. Like, these are all of us problems. So we need to find our way back to a space where we can actually deliberate together, disagree with one another, and it not be the end of the world. At least that's sort of where I'm at right now. I'm feeling a little bit gloomy about rhetoric and our futures. But I don't want to end on a bummer note, even though I've gone 5 minutes long. Apologies for that. I'll try to see if I can trim this down. I don't want to end on a only, sad note. I do think that what we do still matters, and I do think that there's a lot of really great, well-meaning social actors out there. We just need to sort of, I think, realize that we cannot pattern our public social engagements after the way that we engage with each other online, because it's not the same. There's not the same. One is being distorted for the benefit of, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and so on. And the other one is like where we actually live, and that's where the real consequences are, and we need to protect that. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have some nice conversation about these issues, and tell me I'm wrong. Prove me I'm wrong. I'd love to be. So thank you to Professor Willis for this opportunity, and I hope you found something in here of use and maybe spur some thinking. So thanks, gang.